So one of the things one of the things that's really important to get across to you all is that in the specific sense, Carl Jacobi's writing a biography of Henry Ellis to the extent that he can, given the fragmentary nature of the documentation, and it's kind of amazing with really with how much he comes up with, given that Ellis was living a secret life and even had a different name. But also what happens in history books, and this is something you should be aware of as well, he's also writing a bigger story. He's really writing the story of the construction of race and how race is socially constructed. This is an idea that historians use, that racial categories don't come down from God, they're created by society. And that means that they can be flexible. And one of the things that we see with Ellis, Ellis was very, very brilliant. There was something inside him, there was something about him that he was able to look at the color line and to kind of figure it out and to kind of figure it out how he could manipulate it in such a way that worked for him. Now, the key thing that he had going for him, as I said, it was important that he was light-skinned. If he'd been very, very dark, he would not have been able to pass. And the other thing is being that he was born, I don't think that's correct English, but anyway, he was born in Victoria. He grew up in South Texas, surrounded by Tejanos, learned how to speak Spanish fluently at an early age, was very comfortable with Mexican-American culture, and so he kind of picked up on that part of society as well. If he'd been born almost anywhere else in the South, or even the rest of the United States, he wouldn't have had these advantages. But the fact that he was born in South Texas gave him insight into Mexican and the Mexican-American culture, and so he knew how to act. So Ellis never talked about why he passed. It was pretty clear that he saw more opportunity, but he never discussed the process but of passing as someone that's Mexican, and then sometimes he's passed as Cuban, sometimes he passed as Hawaiian. But clearly he saw something, and he saw that the race line could be manipulated, that he had a unique opportunity to manipulate, because of his location on the Texas-Mexican borderlines, that he could manipulate it in such a way that he could create a new life for himself. Now, he could cross boundaries, right? Not only national boundaries, which he does. He goes back and forth from Mexico into the United States at a time when it was much easier to cross the border than it is now. But he also crossed the color line. He figured something out. So he's a very, very brilliant guy. And in the larger sense, the Jacobi book, and this is one of the things that I want you to get out of reading it, or the two chapters that you're reading, is that Jacobi is talking about how Americans and also Mexicans, how they define race. And by looking at someone like Henry Ellis, who plays the color line, you can look at how race is created. By looking at someone who's manipulating racial borders, it brings those borders it brings the outline of them, it clarifies the outline of them. So in the larger sense, the story of Henry Ellis is really the story of race. It's the story of the creation of race, not only in Mexico, but in the United States as well. So, Henry Ellis, just to offer a little bit more detail, as I said a couple of times, born in Victoria, born a slave, 1864, just 2 years before the end of the Civil War. Learns how to speak Spanish. He actually learns how to ride horses, and he learns how to rope from kind of the vaquero culture of South Texas. Decides that he doesn't want to go through life in the United States as an African American because there's so many barriers to African Americans, and the barriers are growing almost at a daily basis. And he decides that he can figure out that he can pass as a Mexican. And so he changes his name. And what he does is he moves to San Antonio. So that's one of the other aspects of this topic that I just really love. Ellis moves from Victoria, and one of the reasons he moves from Victoria is that, of course, Victoria's a small town today, but it was an even smaller town right in the 1870s and 1880s. And people knew his family in Victoria, so he couldn't really pass in Victoria. But by moving to San Antonio, which was a larger town, it was much easier for him to pass as Mexican. So he comes into San Antonio and he begins an import-export business on the main plaza near San Fernando Cathedral. And he also marries, he starts a family in San Antonio as well. And so he decides initially that the best place for him is in San Antonio. But what's interesting, and you'll see this, is that Ellis, who's a very, very complicated guy, he takes a big risk. He moves to San Antonio when he's 24. He gets involved in the cross-border trade, but he also decides to get involved in Texas politics. Now, what's interesting about that is, and it's often forgotten, that even in the 1880s, you still had African Americans running for statewide office in Texas. It was getting harder and harder to do that, but it was still possible. The Republican Party at that point was the home of African Americans, and there were still enough African Americans had not, their vote had not been completely suppressed. It would be very quickly, but in the 1880s it's not completely suppressed. So what Ellis does is he gets involved in African American politics in Texas, which if you think about it is a huge risk on his part, right? Here's a guy that's trying to pass himself off as Mexican American, and suddenly now he's getting involved in a very high profile way in African American politics in Texas. He fought for black representation in the local Republican Party. At rallies, he delivered speeches that caught the attention of the local press. So his speeches are being printed in San Antonio newspapers. At first, the papers referred to him as Mexican Ellis or W.H. Ellis from Mexico. But then he was being described as a colored aspirant for legislative honors. And what happens is he takes a gamble. He's trying to gain political influence in Texas. And he's also, at the same time, he's trying to, hide his identity, but he loses in both respects. He loses both gambles, and he has a double defeat. The African Americans that he supports in Texas, which raises his visibility in Texas in such a way that more and more whites are recognizing that he's African American. So the African American politicians he's supporting are defeated. And then at the same time, he's exposed as an African American because he has, in a very high profile way, fought for the political representations for African Americans in Texas. So he lost. His gamble didn't pay off, and what he has to do is he has to lay low because this gamble that he's taken, and he just has to kind of go underground. And he's still working in San Antonio, but ultimately he's going to make a decision that things are too hot in San Antonio. And as I'll talk about in the next podcast, he goes to Mexico and declares himself a Mexican citizen. So, a very interesting guy. And the last thing I'll say about him in this podcast is African Americans in Texas and in the United States, as he becomes more of a national figure, They always knew that Henry Ellis was African American, that he was passing himself off as Mexican, but they never really outed him. They would kind of talk about it between the lines. So he was a known quantity in the African American community in the sense that people knew that he was African American, that he was passing himself off as a Mexican businessman, but everybody, it still remained unspoken. Whites weren't reading African American newspapers. So he was able, after his defeats in Texas, which you'll read about, he's able to go to Mexico